Okay, fantastic. Can't see me, but you can see my slides. That's the most important thing. All right, so just a little bit of fun. I thought this was very appropriate. One of my members on my team brought this up at Monday's meeting. For those of you that know, we celebrated Halloween just here earlier this week, and I am always surprised by the new ways that people can figure out how to take advantage of IoT technology. So in this case, they took an old party trick, which used hairspray and a candle, and figured out how to automate that and use their mobile device to actually control the flame-throwing pumpkin that the people were setting out on their porches. Real quickly, because I want to focus more kind of on the update, but I realize not everybody's familiar with NIST. I just want to spend a couple of minutes to point out who we are. We are a bureau within the U.S. Department of Commerce. Obviously, our mission is to support U.S. innovation, industrial competitiveness. We are a non-regulatory agency within the U.S. federal government. But that being said, I do always like to point out that when it comes to cybersecurity and when it comes to guidelines for federal agencies, NIST guidelines are mandatory for federal agencies due to FISMA, which is the Federal Information Security Modernization Act that was passed. And as you'll see on the right side of the screen, although I'm going to talk a lot today about our upcoming guidelines around IoT device security, there is a lot of work that goes on at NIST on IoT cybersecurity, and we draw from all of this work, whether it be work looking at low power WAN or lightweight encryption, all the way through our work in the National Cybersecurity Center of Excellence, where we look at enterprise use cases and we look at how organizations can leverage their end-to-end solutions in order to secure IoT devices. So we have 5 principles that we established for the program, and I like to come back to these because I think these still hold true, and they provide background and context for why we approach the work we're doing the way we do. We think when it comes to IoT, the work really needs to be done with a risk-based understanding. And this is both because of the capabilities of the device being directly linked to the risk that device may introduce. But we also understand that it's also very contextual, and it also depends on the use case. It is an ecosystem of things. When we started the program 5 years ago, 5.5 years ago at this point, everyone was talking about the device, but it really is about the system and the ecosystem. The device is an important part of the end-to-end security solution, but as our work demonstrates in the NCCOE, it really requires an end-to-end solution. So we need to be looking at other parts of the ecosystem as well, and where can we introduce security. There's no one size that fits all. I think this is probably something that this entire group probably understands. And the 4th principle is our outcome-based approach. And we adopted the outcome-based approach because we saw a lot of success in the cybersecurity framework, which adopted an outcome-based approach. And what this really says is we want to be able to talk about the outcomes that we desire or that we hope to achieve, and allow for there to be a multitude of standards, implementation approaches, specifications, best practices that really can be developed by the communities that are using those best practices standards, to really allow for flexibility in choosing what is the most appropriate for, whether it be for that customer or whether it be for that manufacturer, to be able to choose the most appropriate approach for addressing and addressing that outcome. And of course, stakeholder engagement is because we can't do it ourselves. This is a very quick timeline of all the things that have occurred over the past couple of years. We started out looking at the system-based view, and I'll talk about that in a second. But we evolved from looking at the system view to the device view, and there were a number of things that happened kind of on the policy front that were drivers for our work. Our work was progressing independently, but at the same time, we actually saw that there was quite a bit of reinforcement for our work, whether it be Executive Order 13800 that was passed under the past administration, all the way through the IoT Cybersecurity Act, which I'll talk about in a bit, and Executive Order 14028. This is a quick kind of snapshot of all the work and the publications that we've worked on. I'll be talking about them in the upcoming slides. The real pivot in our guidelines really occurred between NISTIR 8228 and 8259 and 8259A, which was when we really understood, as we started to engage with the community, what a pivotal role IoT devices played in achieving end-to-end security in the ecosystem. 8228 was our first attempt and looking at the existing risk management frameworks that organizations used and identifying for those organizations, if you are applying the cybersecurity framework, or if you are using NIST Special Publication 800-53 under the risk management framework that NIST has, if you're using those frameworks to address your cybersecurity, how does IoT and introducing IoT technology into your organization actually change both the risk profile as well as how you might have to address those security controls or achieve those subcategories differently? What we did as we identified these different subcategories and controls was we also included in the draft of 8228 in the appendix a list of potential requirements that an organization could require of their suppliers of IoT devices, and ask for those, understanding that if you required these capabilities, we called them, or requirements for your suppliers, it would actually make your job a lot easier as you tried implementing asset management and vulnerability management and data protection. We also included protecting individuals' privacy when we looked at 8228 as well. So coming out of the draft of NISTIR 8228, the feedback was pretty overwhelming that we got asked by the community, can you please take this appendix and turn it into its own guidelines or guidance, because we think this would be really useful even as a standalone document. And we felt that that made sense because again, as we were looking at the existing risk management frameworks and cybersecurity frameworks, we understood that if you look at the right-hand side, there was a lot of good existing guidelines for the customers of IoT devices who had been adopting IoT. But on the other side of the equation, you had IoT device manufacturers who were building devices. We saw that the relationship between the IoT device customers and IoT device manufacturers or suppliers were probably not as closely linked in as far as supply chain goes as you might see in your traditional software. So we decided to turn our attention to the IoT device manufacturers. Understanding, if you go back to the original principles, as we looked at the Appendix A in 8228, and we understood that one size would not fit all, but what we did want to do is we wanted to start from a point of a core IoT cybersecurity capabilities baseline. And the purpose of that was really to try to avoid fragmentation as much as possible. And rather than us jumping straight to identifying, let's say, the federal government as a sector and identifying the requirements for the federal government, that it would be better for us to identify where are the common capabilities. This was documented in NIST IR 8259, 8259A, 8259B. And I won't go into details in explaining this. These are all public documents. These are, NIST recommendations. They are reports that we've put out to be applicable to both, federal government, manufacturers of IoT devices. But if you look at 8259, 8259A and B, which was subsequently published, 8259A and 8259B as core baselines were intended to be starting points for manufacturers, but we really encourage manufacturers to adopt and undertake 6 activities. These activities are more product development lifecycle focused. And provided for them a context of how to think about what your customers' needs are and what their goals are for cybersecurity as you think about incorporating and building in cybersecurity capabilities into your device. And of course, using the core baseline and A and B as a starting point, but potentially adapting that to what you think your customers' needs were. And this is really based on the foundation that a manufacturer of a device probably understands the capabilities of their device the best. They probably understand how they expect their customer to be using this device, or any assumptions that they might be making about how their customer will be using this device. So they really are best positioned to understand what are the types of capabilities they should be building into their device, but always with the customer in mind and a view to how the customer will be using the device. So I touched on a little bit earlier on the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2020. Not to spend too much time talking about this, but once we finish the core capabilities in 8259 and 8259A and B, we knew that we would have to turn our attention towards the federal government because, as I mentioned, NIST is statutorily required to provide guidance and guidelines to federal agencies on how to manage their cybersecurity risks. Well, at the same time, Congress was kind of looking at the same area. Congress was also looking at how can we use the federal government as a way to perhaps drive the market or lead the market towards developing more secure IoT devices. So the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act of 2020 was passed. It directed NIST to develop minimum requirements for federal agencies. There are other parts of the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act as well. Specifically, coordinated disclosure of security vulnerabilities related to IoT devices is also called out in the IoT Cybersecurity Improvement Act, and making those requirements for IoT for federal agencies as they procure IoT devices. There's also going to be follow-on activity as soon as we publish our guidelines, which should be hopefully by the end of this month, where there will be updates, for example, to the federal acquisition regulation, where there will be language that will be added, likely that will require any sort of acquisition of IoT devices to adhere to the NIST guidelines. There are also actions for OMB, the Office of Management and Budget, part of the White House, to work with federal agencies and review their policies and ensure that those are compliant and aligned to the NIST guidelines. And quickly, I would like to kind of just explain what you will likely see, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, coming out of NIST, is going to be these two special publications. It's Special Publication 800-213 and Special Publication 800-213A. Those were already put out for public comment. We have had one round of public comments on that. We received about 600 public comments. We incorporated those as appropriate into the draft publication. We've held a number of public engagements and workshops where we've kind of talked through some of that feedback. And what you'll see at the end of this month is kind of where we've landed. So we look at the baseline for federal agencies that are procuring IoT devices, again, in the context of the existing risk management framework that federal agencies must follow. So we are reinforcing for federal agencies, when you procure an IoT device, you need to be thinking about that device in the context of your organizational risk and in the context of how you are going to select the appropriate security controls based on the results of your risk management assessment. Coming out of that, they will be able to identify what are the appropriate requirements, minimum requirements for that device. That is all in 800-213, the guidelines on how federal agencies should think about the types of risk that IoT devices introduce, and how they should be using the baseline, the federal baseline that is an adaptation of the core baseline that I spoke about previously in 8259A and 8259B, and how they might consider augmenting that baseline and drawing from 800-213A, which is a catalog of IoT device capabilities that might go above and beyond the baseline. And the reasoning really is, again, going back to our core principles, while we can propose a baseline for federal agencies, one size is not going to fit all. Everything has to be done within the context of risk. And the only way you can really understand risk is by having the federal agency consider what are their existing capabilities they have for security, what are the security tools they have in place, what are the network tools they have in place. How are they going to be relying on that device? So we expect that federal agencies will likely develop minimum requirements that are going to be both a combination of the federal baseline as well as some of the capabilities from the catalog, which is 800-213A. So now to Executive Order 14028 on the consumer IoT labeling specifics. So in addition to the voluntary work that we did and the recommendations on, 8259, 8259A and B, that we are working and engaging through international standards, as I mentioned in the chat earlier, we also now have a profile of that core baseline, which is what we've developed for the federal government. Well, in this recent Executive Order 14028, NIST was directed to initiate and work on a consumer IoT device cybersecurity labeling effort. We've been given 270 days to kind of pilot this and demonstrate or at least prove the concept of a cybersecurity label for IoT devices. We have some specific directions we've been given to look at for the criteria, such as increasing comprehensive levels of testing. And of course, we also do plan, and this is really consistent with the way NIST works, look at how this can be possibly compatible with existing labeling schemes that are already out there, and where can we adopt what's already being used. I like to talk about kind of IoT, cybersecurity, and mentally, we've broken this down into kind of three conceptual areas, right? We're trying to understand what should the label convey? What should the label look like? What is it we are going to be communicating to the customer, who's the consumer in this case, the end consumer of the device, or any other stakeholder perhaps of that ecosystem? Conformity. How do we expect the manufacturer to actually demonstrate what they've actually done and that they've actually conformed to the criteria? For those of you who are familiar with conformity assessment, there's a wide range of ways to approach conformity assessment or demonstrating conformity, all the way from a supplier's declaration of conformity all the way through to some third-party verification of that conformity. And then, of course, underpinning all of this are what are the actual criteria? What is it that we expect the manufacturer to do? Okay, sorry about that. Sorry about flipping back and forth. So here again, what have we done so far? When we kicked off the executive order, there was an initial call for white papers. We had kind of left out the IoT labeling as the call for papers because we felt a lot of the work around software supply chain, the work on a software product label, were kind of at a different starting point. We'd already had so many existing conversations and workshops and publications and reports on IoT device security. that we felt we didn't want to kind of reopen that. We wanted to build on what we had already developed. So what we did is we did a landscape review instead, and we found this to be very useful. We started off with a landscape review when we started down 8259 A and B. The IoT Security Foundation's work was one of the very early works we looked at when we did that landscape review, as well as a number of others. And you'll see in the landscape review that we did again, what we wanted to do was understand again, where do we see the trends? Where do we see there seems to be consensus? Where do we see that there is resonance with our existing core baseline that we've put out there? And one thing that we did identify was as well, what is the consensus? Are they looking beyond the device, and how are others in the ecosystem looking at the IoT product? Are they considering it just the device? Are they considering the cloud components of an IoT product? Are they considering the mobile app part of the product? So again, as we started looking at an IoT product label, we started thinking about the device also has a product, and the label is intended to reflect the product. So taking this all into account, we drafted a draft baseline security criteria for consumer IoT devices. We published that on the 31st of August. We just closed public comment last week. We did receive over 400 comments, and we are working through those comments as well. And then we did also hold a public workshop on the 14th and 15th of September, where we held panel discussions, and we also invited the community to give us feedback and engage in discussion with us based on the draft white paper we published. So what did we find in the landscape review? We found there was reasonable consistency with the core baseline, which is always good news when you start looking out there and you see that there seems to be a lot of general consensus. The other thing we did really find is that we did find that there were a lot of existing programs that were looking at all the product components. And the reason I want to talk about this a little bit is because although 8259A and 8259B are really focused on the device, part of the reason we focused on device guidelines was because we felt there was existing guidance out there, whether it be for mobile app security or whether it be for cloud security. And we didn't want to really reinvent the wheel on all of that. But what we had seen was a gap on the device guidance. So it's not surprising that as we kind of looked outside of our existing guidance, that we did see that there was support across the ecosystem to look at these different, what we call components of the product. So some early, obviously, comments back. This is all very preliminary, but loud and clear, we keep hearing fragmentation is a significant concern from both our international commenters as well as domestic. There was a lot of discussion in the feedback on assessing a manufacturer's practices versus the product. There's two camps here. One camp thinks it's critical that manufacturers do things like a risk analysis and threat analysis. But at the same time, though, there is also a concern over how predictable can it be that you actually are producing a more secure product. There is consensus in what we heard around consumers expecting the label to cover the whole product and not just the device. And of course, how do we convey this complex information to general consumers? We do not intend with a label to assert that the device is a secure device. But what we are trying to do is provide transparency into the practices of the manufacturer and that there is certain security that has been built into the device, but by no means is that an assertion that the device is absolutely secure. And some things to still be addressed, what is there really a meaningful or a useful approach to tiers? How can that look? Who determines the tiers? How do you determine which tier is appropriate for a certain type of device. Who makes that choice? The individual, the consumer, or the manufacturer? And again, we want to hold true to our outcome perspective. So how can we do that yet still ensure that there's going to be consistency? And the last thing, and I won't talk very much longer because I do realize I am running out of time soon, and I want to allow for any questions. For those of you that may be looking kind of broadly at the IoT space, again, because there is a lot happening here in the US, both in the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. There was a public law that was passed at the beginning of this year, the 1st of January of 2021. It directed the Department of Commerce, which since then has delegated this statutorily required FACA is called, this IoT Steering Committee and IoT Federal Working Group to NIST. And you will still see shortly both the steering committee is being set up, which is going to consist of members of the private sector stakeholders. It is going to cover everything from smart traffic technologies, augmented logistics, precision agriculture, public safety, healthcare. There's going to be a steering committee that is going to look at certain areas of interest around IoT. What can be done? What can the US federal government do to either remove barriers to more IoT device or IoT technology adoption across the US and across those different economies, as well as look at where the US federal government could perhaps do something to kind of spur IoT adoption along. We will also have a mirror federal working group that's going to consist of obviously commerce and transportation, OMB, FTC, OSTP. We are going to look at the recommendations that we received from the FACA, but we will also be looking at the space ourselves as a federal working group, and the public, it's a public law, it's out there if anybody's interested in reading a little bit more about it. And we will be delivering a report to Congress that kind of summarizes both how we responded to the advice that was provided by the IoT Steering Committee, as well as our own recommendations for ourselves. And these are all just a little bit more detail. And I'd like to wrap up there. I'm happy to give out my contact information, but you can always reach us via our email on the screen.